the fanatical, scripture-quoting religious leader who moved to Waco to await the end of the world, instead maybe to blame tonight for the deaths of several federal agents.
Doomsday in Waco.
There was some sporadic gunfire this afternoon.
Well, you know what they think of me? They think I'm the son of God.
He was sitting around really wacky ways to manipulate people.
Purchasing huge amounts of weaponry.
The end of the world would come in a great battle.
David Koresh knows you're coming.
I'll meet you at the door any time. God will have to sort that out, won't he? There are children and women in here, and to call it off.
On about 25.
Scared you so much.
These people killed 4 federal officials in the line of duty.
We got to call this raid off.
Waco was awesome. Awesome, extremely impressive or daunting, inspiring great admiration, apprehension, or fear. The awesome power of the atomic bomb. This is YouTube 2023, baby. And I'm not talking about what everyone already knows about Waco. The government showed up, there was a standoff, and then the compound burnt down. Yes, that's important, but understand, there was so much more to that story. A lot more. The whole premise of that situation was batshit insane. And it all started with Lois Roden. It's 1978. A woman by the name of Lois Roden becomes the president of a small religious group called the Branch Davidians. She's now the president because her husband Benjamin, the founder, passed away, right? So the first few years, nothing really big's happening. They're just eating brisket, doing God shit. They're just chilling. They have 1,000 acres of land in northeast Waco on the property that they call Mount Carmel. Lois took this presidency, she was already in her mid-60s. She's not old per se, but that 401k is probably looking pretty thick, right? So how this hierarchy works for the Branch Davidians is that most likely in due time, she's going to hand over the presidency to her son, George Roden.
Wait until you hear about George.
Fast forward to 1981. Did I just spit? Lois Roden is now 65 years old, and you know her son George is thirsty for that leadership. I'm ready to get religious, mama. Just when George was about to take control of Mount Carmel, Lois Roden then became distracted by the rustling winds in the distance of a 1968 Chevy Camaro. And in that Camaro was a Marlboro Red smoking, whiskey drinking, rock and roll playing man. A mystery man who just recently found something. What was it that he found? Jesus. And that was the day that George Roden laid his eyes on public enemy number 1. Vernon Howell. Vernon Howell is now the newest member of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. So you know how when you start a new job somewhere, your goal is to not step on anyone's toes, don't rub anyone the wrong way, just kind of ease in, right? 2 years into his stay at Mount Carmel, he is now claiming to be the prophecy of God and also banging Lois. She's 67 now.
Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
Vernon was 22, banging Lois Roden, 67 years old, and he got her pregnant. How do you think George feels about this? A man just comes out of nowhere with a cool car, starts banging his mom, and then tries taking his job. You don't see that in the real world. That's some shit you hear in your headset playing Call of Duty.
I can't feel my legs.
I am going to go over to your mother's house, become the son of God, get that bitch knocked up, and let you learn that I am your fucking father. Alright, bitch? Alright, bitch? And this didn't even faze Vernon. He was just like, I got her pregnant because, like, God said so. And she's pregnant now. And that probably means I'm the chosen one. Now I'm gonna let you be the judge of how this impacted George, Lois's son, by simply just telling you a couple things that happened soon after. Surprisingly, things were civil for a short amount of time, but then out of nowhere, a fire breaks out, causing $500,000 in damage to one of the buildings in Mount Carmel. But it took no time at all for George to be like, it was 100% Vernon. But Vernon then clapped back with, no man set that fire. banging your mom. But luckily for George, he convinced enough Branch Davidians for them to think that Vernon started the fire. George having a little bit more clout in that house at the time, they were able to kick out Vernon at gunpoint, but Vernon brought about 25 Branch Davidians to Palestine, Texas, about 90 miles outside of Waco. So that's good, right? Both parties are doing their own thing. There's 90 miles between them. What can possibly go wrong? By the way, it's 1986 and Lois Roden dies. Now this would naturally give the leadership to George Roden, her son. When that information gets to Palestine, Texas, Vernon feels compelled and not threatened at all to just be like, well, let's go back.
What could possibly go wrong?
So Vernon shows back up. George is of sound mind, or he is so batshit insane, he went out to the Branch Davidian cemetery and dug up a corpse, digs up a dead body, and says, bring this body back to life, bud. Yo! Now Vernon has his problems. George has a right to hate Vernon, but Vernon is a little bit more cognitively there. Because when Vernon saw this offer being presented to him to prove that he is the Holy One, his reaction was pretty acceptable. Resurrect this corpse. Did go to the police station to say that George Roden was exhuming a dead corpse. Then the police were like, yeah, we need like photographic evidence now. So now Vernon has to go back to Mount Carmel and take a picture of the corpse. So he fucking scrounges up 7 of his followers that don't like George, and they head to Mount Carmel to get a picture of a corpse. And all of Vernon's followers were locked and loaded, ready to do this against George's will. Except one problem, they forgot a fucking camera. But it was too late. A firefight ensues. George gets shot multiple times and he's pinned up against a tree. He survived. The local sheriff showed up, de-escalated the situation, but now George Roden is going to put Vernon on trial for attempted murder.
And there'll be another gun battle.
And it don't look like this is BB gun action to me.
And that court battle ultimately ended with Vernon and his followers being acquitted due to a mistrial. See how crazy it was? We're still in the 80s. ATF has not shot one bullet at Mount Carmel at this point. That's in the 90s. But after the acquittal, it quieted down a little bit. Also, George Roden put an axe in someone's head.
Bruh.
We ain't done. George became so paranoid that Vernon was going to retaliate against him after being acquitted that this man, Wayman Dale Adair, approached the compound to suggest that he was in fact the Messiah. And that's when George was just over it. Axe to the face! George murdered that man, Final Destination style. And ultimately leads us to the demise of George, Lois's son. Guilty for murdering Mr. Adair and actually sent to an insane asylum, where he still continued to file legal paperwork against Vernon. He escaped once, they caught him. He escaped a second time, tried to bolt to Israel, and then in 1998 he escaped one more time, but they did find him deceased due to a heart attack. That brings us to the ending of the story of George Roden. But what about Vernon? He assumed leadership of the Branch Davidians in the Waco, Texas compound, where in 1990 he then went to the Superior Court to legally change his name to David Koresh. And that actually just brings us to the actual raid itself. Ultimately, it was ATF and David Koresh at the wrong place at the very wrong time. So ATF has had their eyes on David Koresh for quite some time now. In fact, just one day before the raid, there was articles titled "The Sinful Messiah" coming out of the Waco Tribune-Herald, the local newspaper. Not only was the paper alleging that he was abusing children, but he was also participating in statutory rape because he was married to children as young as 12 years old. Now, David had already come out and said that yes, he's a believer of polygamy. He's a very traditional person because all he does is speak Old Testament. God. But this isn't the type of marriage you see on the Hallmark Christmas special every year. This is Bible marriage, right? Old Testament Bible marriage. Homeboy had 140 wives, and a shit ton of them already had husbands. Like legal, observed by the state of Texas husbands that were also a part of Mount Carmel. So this was just a giant Koresh cuckold. So obviously this perked up ATF's ears a little bit, but of course it is hearsay technically, so they sent 2 agents to go undercover to investigate, because no f***ing person in that compound just wants to go up to David Koresh, just be like, Daddy, chill. But ultimately investigating that angle from ATF, it's complicated. The child endangerment, the religious conflict, all that shit can get a little messy with ATF. ATF is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But here's the smoking gun that brought us to the raid. The UPS whoopsie-daisy. So the UPS guy that delivers the packages to the Waco compound had to give the sheriff of Waco a buzz on the horn. Because maybe he took a sharp turn or something, but a box fell over that was supposed to go to the Waco compound. Now this wasn't a book of Bibles or a What Would Jesus Do sticker bundle. It wasn't a dozen eggs. It was a dozen of grenades. Those. So ATF has officially become confident to issue a warrant to the Waco compound based on the belief that they are stockpiling firearms. And yes, there's the undercard of they could be abusing children and f***ing cucking everyone in the house. It is a cloudy morning and ATF is en route. This mission's like meh to them. They're gonna show up to the property, they're gonna serve the warrant, they're gonna get exactly what they want, and then they're gonna leave and probably not even be his friend after. Much like your matches on Tinder. So the raid is now minutes away, and there's only one local news reporter even talking about this because he got tipped off by ATF, right? He gets to the area around the compound and gets lost. He decides to go to the local mailman all like, yo, ATF's about to raid this place and I'm trying to find it. Do you know where Mount Carmel is? And the mailman knew, because he was a branch Davidian. Element of surprise out the window. That mailman hightailed it to the Waco compound, basically said fuck you to the reporter, and told David Koresh ATF were on their way. A convoy of ATF agents have now rolled down the dirt road of the Branch Davidian compound, and their statement saying that David Koresh actually came out of the front door like, Ow. I'm going inside. Massive firefight ensues between the Branch Davidians and ATF. Bullets flying everywhere. Dozens of Branch Davidians are shooting at ATF, and ATF is shooting at a dozen Branch Davidians, and no one knows who shot the first shot. So how the hell are you gonna call a ceasefire, right? To this day, it is debated on who shot the first shot. ATF argues that it was one of the Branch Davidians that shot at ATF. Of course, the Branch Davidians said ATF shot the first shot. Some even say the ATF dog team neutralized the dogs that were in the kennel in front of the compound, and that triggered the first shot. No one really knows, because there was only one reporter on the scene to get the footage that we're looking at now. It was the KWTX reporter who was looking for directions to the compound that accidentally tipped off the Branch Davidians that ATF were coming. When you have a government shooting at a religious compound, and the religious compound is shooting back, and no one knows who shot the first shot, who the f*** are you gonna call? One of the Branch Davidians decided to call the police.
Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch, may I help you? Yeah, there's 75 men around our building and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel? Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off. Right.
The sheriff then had to get in contact with somebody on the ground at Mount Carmel to demand a ceasefire. The communication of this bullshit was nuts. The only way that a message should get from the compound to ATF, because there's bullets flying at everybody, is that they had to go through the sheriff's department. So they had 2 jurisdictions working off each other to get everyone to shut the f*** up. And now reports show the news guy then reached out to the police, where the police was able to demand the news guy to yell out a ceasefire to the ATF agents. A news reporter is yelling ceasefire to ATF. And then a slow ripple effect came into conclusion, and we were officially at the Waco compound. No more bullets. ATF took the opportunity to retreat their agents back further from the compound, where unfortunately 4 agents lost their life, as well as multiple Branch Davidians inside the compound. So now that the firefight is over, no one's leaving. The Branch Davidians are hunkered down in the compound, and ATF ain't going nowhere without David Koresh. We've officially entered a standoff. So now with ATF having lost 4 members of their team, we are now looking into a federal investigation that's being led by the FBI. So later that day, FBI shows up, creates a command center, and it's being led by Jeff Jamar. Now because the shootout resulted in death of ATF agents, federal agents, the FBI is now treating this as a hostage situation.
The goal is to resolve the situation ultimately in federal court with no further bloodshed.
They're going to create a perimeter around the compound and then bring a negotiation team to come in and help release the children that are inside of Mount Carmel. Now at this point, FBI has no idea about the conditions going on in the compound. Who's hurt, who's dead, but the compound did have a telephone inside. And that led David Koresh to actually call a radio show.
So all of what's happening here is basically a conspiracy for what you're teaching?
Prophecy. This is it. This is the end.
He was shot in the hip as well as in the wrist. He was doing an interview on CNN about his religious teachings. He was calling the news, not talking to the negotiators at this time. So FBI had to knock that shit off real quick, cut off the phone lines to the compound, and only provided them with a phone that allows them to talk directly with negotiators.
Now, who am I speaking with? This is David Koresh. Okay, David. The Notorious. What did you guys do that for? You brought a bunch of guys out here and you killed some of my children. We told you we wanted to talk. No, how come you guys try to be ATF agents? How come you try to be so big all the time?
And the FBI had really 2 goals in this situation. Get the kids out and make sure David Koresh isn't suicidal. David confirmed that he's not suicidal, and now their goal was to get children out of the house. The first 2 days of the event, they were able to get a total of 14 kids released from the compound. At this point, David Koresh is in direct communication with the negotiators, and he officially has his first demand. He wants to be able to publicly broadcast his sermon on the radio. But he took all the time in the world, took a few days. Because FBI couldn't do shit about negotiations because David was, no joke, quote, waiting for further instructions from God. At this point, negotiators were able to get 4 adults and 8 more children out of the compound.
I, David Koresh, agree upon the broadcasting of this tape to come out peacefully with all the people.
And one little caveat to the early days of the standoff, there was a branch Davidian trying to sneak in from the outside world to help David Koresh, and FBI spotted him and just shot him a bunch of times. He's dead now. Now, FBI is getting pretty impatient at this point. It's been a few weeks into the standoff. They're trying to work negotiations between them. Trying to bring milk to the kids, trying to get more adults and their children out of the compound, but they're running very low on patience. So what bright idea did they have mustered up their tuckus? They blast a shit ton of light onto the compound 24/7 at that point, and then they turn this small ass town of Waco, Texas into a fucking Van Halen concert, but they ain't playing the hits. They're playing the now that's what I call holy fucking shit, I want to get out of here Tibetan monks chants. Rabbits getting slaughtered. Ew. And worst of all, Nancy Sinatra's Boots Were Made for Walking on repeat.
One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you.
That. Now, it's important for me not to confuse you with numbers, dates, and timeline events. I want to keep this consistent, so if you see me or hear me jumping around a little bit, I'm not doing it because I think you're fucking stupid. I'm doing it because I want the story to flow. So at this point in the standoff, FBI has cut off the compound's power. There's been a handful of releases from adults to children, but there's one problem on David Koresh's side. David claims that every child left in that compound is a biological descendant of his.
My oldest son, his name is Cyrus. Sit over here, son.
Remember, this is David Kuckin Koresh. He had like 12 kids at that point, but he wasn't trying to let them go. And there was another issue to all the people getting released to the compound. They began to notice, as press were following the story very closely, that the children were being secluded in their own areas and being watched by the federal agency. Their parents were being arrested and put into federal prison. So obviously it was telling the Branch Davidians currently in the compound, yeah, you walk out, you go to jail. Obviously not good for the negotiating table. So in this communication breakdown, David Koresh felt it was the perfect time to also say, by the way, I'm Jesus. David Koresh got his opportunity to go on the radio, but it didn't really stick or get a lot of traction. So this whole time, FBI is waiting for him to write his 7 seals interpretation from the Revelations book, and he wants to be able to broadcast to the world, because, you know, he's Jesus. With the peppering of people being released, we're getting to a friction point. Not just between Koresh and the negotiations, but also the negotiations and the FBI. Because they've been in contact with Janet Reno, who's totally not everyone's grandmother from the early 90s, who gave the green light to use CS gas to get them out of the compound, which in the Geneva Convention, that was banned, so they're basically just publicly okay with a war crime. The FBI is officially ready to push some buttons. They take a f***ing tank and they drive it over the parking lot, destroying Koresh's 1968 Chevy. They're clearly trying to antagonize him that they're done with this game. Jeff DeMar is over it. He's embarrassed because this thing's been going on for almost 50 days. But all the Branch Davidians did in response is hold a big sign up on the tower of the compound that said, "Flames await." The last day. At 5:50 a.m., David Koresh got a phone call from the police stating that they are all under arrest, they're done negotiations, and they're going to be administering tear gas into the compound. But David Koresh was packing, dude. Everyone got a gas mask inside the compound. Apparently they just got those things hanging around. As well as Koresh advising all the women put wet towels over the babies and the young children so they don't inhale the gas as well because the masks didn't fit the kid. Tanks rolled up in tear gas and boom! Right into the compound. While on the intercom, someone was going, "This is not an assault.
This is not an assault. We are not entering the building."
Like, professional gaslighting right there. And at this point, the Branch Davidians are going frantic. But the compound is built to protect this kind of situation. You see, what I've been holding back from saying this whole video is that the reason why David Koresh was so believable to the people in the Branch Davidians is because what's happening, he predicted in advance. And he interpreted every action that would happen as the actions of God. Like, say what you want about how batshit insane he was. He was religiously calling balls and strikes, so his followers would obviously trust him because he's been right. The whole stockpiling of guns and religious sermons and the 7 seals, this is all related to a government body or a larger power trying to dismantle that religious community in a battle bigger than Babylon. And what do we have?
Point guns in the direction of my wives and my kids, damn it, I'll meet you at the door any time. And I'm sorry some of you guys got shot. But, hey, God will have to sort that out, won't he?
Again, I'm not saying he was right on good faith, pun intended, but he was telling them the information they probably needed to hear for them to believe that he was making all the right moves. So as the tear gas is getting administered, they are trying to leave not one area unturned. They are gassing every open area in the compound that they can find, present with people or not. At that point, there was 2 locations that Koresh advised people to go to avoid getting gassed. They had a shelter, which was below but in front of the compound. And then there was an underground school bus, which was to the left side if you're standing on the front of the compound. But as the world was watching this situation, somebody noticed something happening on the upper floors of the compound. You have a government agency pumping CS gas into a building with religious folks, women, and children, and it's on fucking fire now. Jeff DeMar, the leader of this situation, was advised that there is a flammable component to CS gas, but in that specific moment, all he saw was an opportunity to see if they were going to come out. Because they're on fire, no one was getting out. At this point in the standoff, it was a stalemate. The only thing that they could do is watch this compound burn. Now, there was pops and bangs all over the compound, but you couldn't distinguish what they were coming from. But right before the compound was completely engulfed in flames, a few Branch Davidians did escape the flames, that including Justin Thibodeau, who provided a lot of information towards this video. But as the building was now one giant fireball,
had started stockpiling explosives and different devices so that they could build their own explosives. So clearly that may have added to this fire spreading so quick. There's no word on where the 95 people, that includes some 25 people under the age of 18, where they are now.
74 people lost their lives in that building, including David Koresh. However, when they recovered David Koresh's body, they did find a bullet hole in the skull. Kind of led to the question of, did he kill himself? Did his right-hand man, Steve Schneider, kill him? No one knows. No one can really tell. But ultimately, after the lives lost and the tragedy that took place on that compound in 1993, it left way more questions than answers. But I can tell you, knowing what I know now and what Waco led to, and being the exact age of David Koresh at 33 years old, I can tell you if there was one thing that was very weird to say I've done, is go to the compound on the 30th anniversary and just say I was there. It's crazy to think that 30 years ago, to this day, the world was watching. And right now, there's press to celebrate the anniversary, but it's very quiet. It's a little windy, but it's super somber. You know, in that moment, it had me wondering. This compound was just on a giant field. There was some trees, but it was mostly just a field with a body of water on the other side. If that's how windy it was, and it just was a normal day, there was no like wind advisory in the forecast, it was just a normal sunny day. How fast that fire would have gone through that building with winds like 30, 40 miles an hour. Like, you could tell by my microphone. I had to throw away half the shit because it was too loud. Now, because of the size of this compound and how different things are now, it's hard to really get a pinpoint of kind of how to tell where I am. This is a massacre. Vault. Mothers and children cast.
Put that on the warrant. Former Homeland Security. David gets up at the time you think he might argue, bring up other photograph. You know, he doesn't do any of that. He just accepts it. Walks to the middle of the group and says, well, you know, somebody's got to be able to.
Let me talk about him. This man was kind of doing all the interviews with the news people and the documentary people. And I'll start by saying he was super duper nice because he let me carry my dog into the church, which was unexpected. The point I want to drive home here is that this church is still active. They all see David Koresh as a prophet. But I think that's just a fun piece of information to share with you. There is still proactive Branch Davidians that still see David Koresh as a Messiah. In 2023!
These guys really needed the money. They're like, yeah, well, let's make a deal. We'll cut you in. Yeah, sounds good. So they started doing business with them. And that went on for decades. And they, what was
FBI trophy pictures.
I'm going to have to leave this counter here. I'm just getting a little too...
It's getting heavy.
It's getting heavy. Can you move up just?
Yeah.
That's good.
Nice meeting you.
Oh, I'm just looking for street.
Oh,
It's
okay.
nice meeting you.
I didn't know if you were looking.
Yeah.
And become partners with it.
I was not expecting what I saw when I walked in. First of all, the building is like frozen in time. It feels like 1993 in there. Secondly, I have never seen a church go so extra on somebody not God. Remember Hey Arnold when Helga made like the shrine of Arnold? You remember. It was like one of those things, but of David Koresh.
And we can't just kill him and stuff because that will just create a giant. And I mean, we're out with her son and she...
The whole going inside thing was just weird to me. Because half the room were just like tourists, and the other half were like active Branch Davidians. They don't really know what lunch table to sit at in that cafeteria. Then I left. But right as you exit the new Branch Davidian church, there is a memorial for the events that took place 30 years ago.
There's Lois Roden, followed by Vernon Wayne Howell.
Who were banging, by the way? Alright, so now I'm a couple miles away from the compound, and there's a little caveat that I wanted to add. A few miles away from the compound that we were just at is where ATF and FBI had all the press hanging out. There was also some protesters. 2 years after the Waco siege actually takes place, the Oklahoma City bombing was organized by Timothy McVeigh as a direct response to the ATF for what they did at Waco. So,